Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 37 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a sparsely furnished hospital consultation room. Two men stand facing each other. One is a young black man, Christopher. The other, Bruce, a white man, is a junior doctor. Christopher is hyped up, full of excited energy. He's due to be released from hospital tomorrow after 28 days under psychiatric observation. However, it is clear from their first exchanges that Bruce is concerned about the prospect of Christopher leaving the hospital. They are joined by a senior psychiatric consultant, Robert, who Bruce is asked to confer with on Christopher's case. The senior doctor is blithely confident about Christopher's release, much to Bruce's frustration. So begins what becomes an extended debate over the ensuing 24 hours between Robert and Bruce over Christopher's diagnosis and treatment, in which Christopher finds himself a pawn in an increasingly bitter and personal power struggle between the two professionals. This is Joe Penhall's explosive and unsettling play, Blue Orange, which exposes the uncertainties and dangers around the diagnosis of mental illness, the latent racial prejudices that can distort our judgments, and the pernicious inflections of hierarchical power in interpersonal relationships. Blue Orange premiered at the National Theatre in April 2000 and transferred for a 6-month run in London's West End a year later, winning the Evening Standard Best Play Award, as well as both the Critics' Circle and Laurence Olivier Awards for Best New Play. It was also adapted by Penhall himself into a BBC television play in 2005, directed by Howard Davis, and has been revived on stage a number of times since, including, as I speak, in a new production co-produced by the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton, the Oxford Playhouse, and the Theatre Royal Bath, where it will tour to all 3 theatres this month. And I was lucky enough to see it in Bath this week. The author of Blue Orange, Joe Penhall, is acclaimed as both a playwright and a screenwriter, having written a dozen plays, including Some Voices, Pale Horse, Dumb Show, and Birthday, all for the Royal Court Theatre, as well as more recently Mood Music at the Old Vic and the musical Sunny Afternoon, which he wrote with Ray Davis of the Kinks and which won 4 Olivier Awards in 2015. His screenwriting credits include the films from the novels Enduring Love and The Road, and the TV series Moses Jones and Mindhunter. The new production of Blue Orange is directed by James Dacre, the artistic director of the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton. And I'm excited and honored to say that both James and Joe are with me today to talk about Joe's powerful and provocative play. Welcome to you both. Thanks very much for joining me, and congratulations on the new production.
Thanks, Douglas. It's good to be here.
Before we dive in, I must add a proper introduction to you, James. James Dacre has been artistic director of the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton since 2013. The Royal and Derngate is one of our outstanding regional theatres, commissioning and co-producing a consistently successful stream of new work that regularly tours and reaches the West End. Recent productions include T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, Alone in Berlin, The Worst Witch, Touching the Void, and The Lovely Bones. James himself has directed world premieres of adaptations of Huxley's Brave New World and Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, as well as Roy Williams' Soul and Arthur Miller's The Hook, as well as a diverse catalog of other new and classic titles. Before the Royal and Derngate, James directed shows at numerous of our best regional and London theatres, including Manchester Royal Exchange, the New Vic, Theatre Royal Bath, the Travers, Trafalgar Studios, and Shakespeare's Globe, among others. I could go on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just start on this play. So, as I said in the introduction, Blue Orange was written just over 20 years ago. So my first question to you both is, why do you think it is timely to revive it now? James, am I right in assuming that it was your initiative to do the play? So if it was, what led you to think it was the right time?
It came about really like all the best collaborations through a series of conversations between 2 of the acting company, Charles Torreira, Michael Balogun, and Joe and myself. And of course, it's been a really important production, both here to us in Northampton, but also to the teams in both Bath and Oxford, because after 18 months of closure, we've started to welcome audiences once more. And after this terrible period that has kept people apart, we so relish that opportunity to welcome our audiences with open arms to congregate again. And it felt so important that in doing so, we were launching our reopening season with a piece of work that celebrated the raw power of theatre and the ability of extraordinary actors to conjure up powerful stories and worlds on stage that, above all, are driven by language and character and narrative. And it was almost kind of serendipitous that Michael and Giles, in our early discussions, and I all almost said out loud Blue Orange at exactly the same time. And we were so thrilled then when we approached Joe and pitched this idea of a revival 20 years after the original production, but also a revival both after a pandemic and at a time of enormous social and political and cultural change, that he gave his endorsement of the idea both of revisiting this text, but also really shining a new light on it for 2021.
You mentioned enormous cultural change. So, Joe, in the interim 20 years, and you come back to it, what did you feel now about the differences between the time when you wrote it and the world that we're living in now? And how did you feel that the play would now speak to our current world?
Well, the huge thing that's happened in the last few years are these two social revolutions, one sparked by the Me Too movement and one sparked by the Black Lives Matter movement. And they really have been some cultural revolutions. They really have literally changed everything. So the obvious question to ask is, how has this changed society and how would it change Blue Orange? Because Blue Orange is very much about the community and what's going on in the community and what's wrong with the community. And, you know, when Blue Orange was done, in a nutshell, it's about a man who appears in a mental hospital claiming to be the long-lost illegitimate son of Idi Amin, and he's in a mental hospital. And for one senior psychiatrist, this suggests that he's got a complicated backstory, but is not necessarily mad or schizophrenic or anything with a pathology. And to a junior psychiatrist, it suggests all the hallmarks of paranoid schizophrenia. And that was a hallmark of the mental health system 20 years ago, you know, that there were an awful lot of people who weren't from a kind of white Anglo-Saxon background, were in mental hospitals with all sorts of really complicated problems and backstories. A psychiatrist friend of mine said that they did actually have a patient that was claiming to have been stalked and harassed and shot by Idi Amin's secret police in London. And it was true. So to do this play now, where people are really alert to the complicated narrative of being Black in Britain now, you know, and people's sometimes complicated ancestry, and you know, we're also much more alert to it and sensitive about it, and take it a lot more seriously, quite frankly. Even very conservative people have been forced to take it seriously. We know all about institutionalized racism now, which was a phrase that hadn't really been coined when the play was written. That sort of came in after the Macpherson report. So it's really interesting to see how the play would fare now, and it is very different doing it now.
Yeah, you're both spot on, of course, that there can't be two more sensitive or topical debates possibly, or issues, than mental health and race. And then our alertness, as you say, to those is very different than it was 20 years ago. In fact, it's extraordinary you say that the term institutional racism probably didn't exist as that short a time ago.
It existed, but it wasn't in common parlance, you know.
Right. So as you've alluded to, the play is about mental health, but it also talks about race, and we'll come to both of these in some detail, inevitably. I thought it was interesting also, I picked up on something you were saying, James, and possibly even before we came on air, which is about the nature of discourse as well, and that there's something about the form of this play and the fact that it's asking these questions and debating these questions in a measured and obviously dramatic, but in a measured and balanced way that is interesting in our time, because we're used to vitriolic differences of opinion and the way that they're expressed. And so I think the way that this play deals with these issues is interesting in itself, or the nature of the discourse is interesting in itself. But before we go into too much more detail, one of the features of the podcast is that I like to give our listeners who don't know the play a little bit of a synopsis about what happens in it. Joe, I guess as it's your play, would you be able to give us a brief synopsis?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it really, really brief. I mean, the main hook of it, the main action of it is this young Black mental patient in a mental hospital is expecting to be released the next day. But lately he's been claiming to be the son of Idi Amin, amongst other things. and the doctors are beginning to question whether he's well enough to be released. And the other two characters, a senior consultant psychiatrist and a junior house officer psychiatrist, are arguing about whether Christopher is presenting with the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, and these are fixed beliefs, these are delusionary beliefs, or whether there's some substance to it, whether it's quite possible that he is the offspring of Idi Amin. Idi Amin had 43 children, and some of them have made their way to London. It's a battle over the truth and over whether to let him go or keep him in.
That point about Idi Amin is extraordinary, because in the way the dynamic of the play unfolds, there's a moment when Christopher reveals that he thinks he's the son of Idi Amin. And of course, this seems to tip the balance into his view that he must be completely deluded. However, as you say, I did go and look up the fact that Idi Amin really did have 43 children, and that one of his wives, he had 5 or 6 wives, and one of his wives ended up working as a hairdresser in Tottenham or something like that.
Yeah.
So the truth is stranger than fiction, perhaps. And in the first act in particular, there's a shocking moment in the debate, because throughout the play, what we're really doing is trying to decipher partly about what is Christopher's state of mind, how ill or otherwise is he. And there's a moment in the first act where Bruce, the young doctor, is becoming frustrated that the senior doctor, Robert, doesn't really understand the full extent of Christopher's delusions or state of mind. And he asks Christopher what color the oranges, there's a few oranges in a bowl on a table, what color the oranges are, and to which Christopher replies, they're blue. And I mean, obviously, this means that the debate's taking a bit of a turn. And it also leads us, I guess, to the question about the title of the play, Joe, which is, again, coming back to you, but is that I've always been struck by the title Blue Orange, that not only is the title of the play not just Blue Oranges or Blue Orange single, but Blue / Orange. And this may be a bit pedantic, but I wonder why you chose that title, what that signifies.
They were interchangeable. The blueness and orangeness were interchangeable, and they were certainly interchangeable in Christopher's mind. And I think, to be honest, in the 90s, I did a lot of plays at the Royal Court, and so did Carol Churchill, and she had a play called Blue Backed Kettle, which for some reason I always thought was a really stylish title. And I guess it was sort of a riff on that. And I've noticed that other people since then have come up with the odd similar thing. It's just linguistically, it's just hooky, and it's incredibly simple, almost sawn off and truncated. Yeah, and yet it's somehow got its own poetry.
Yes. James, what did you make of the title?
Well, you captured this, I think, brilliantly earlier, Douglas, but one of, for me, the key themes of the play is that things are rarely as simple as they seem at the surface. And of course, one extraordinary thing that this play encourages audiences to do is to look further and to listen deeper. And in an age as polarized and as divisive and as angry as our own, it's a play that refuses to reduce things to 60 characters in a way that so much of our social media discourse does today, and really encourages an audience to always hear both sides of the debate and to make up their own minds. And this is theatre as a debating chamber, and the thrill of both rehearsing this piece and watching it is that it so forces you to ensure balance and to ensure that actually both sides of an argument are being made with equal conviction, and both prosecution and defense are balanced effectively. And of course, the genius of this title is that it's about opposites, and it captures that sense of that almost dialectical sense of what it means to put an audience in a position where they are forced to continue the debate longer into the evening after they've left the theatre. And it's been really rewarding to see how families and couples and groups of friends have come to see this production, and they have taken different sides and really, after the event, aligned themselves to the perspectives of different characters, and hopefully continued debates around power, privilege, welfare, race, the NHS, the workplace environment, long into the evening.
Yes, they do. And I was privileged to be part of a discussion after the performance I saw in Bath last week with the cast. And there was a lot of discussion ongoing. And I was listening because I was anticipating this conversation, and I was listening to reactions from the audience, and exactly that goes on. And as you say, Joe, the words are interchangeable. I think the slash basically suggests that, doesn't it? That something can be simultaneously two different things.
Well, it's interesting. What James is saying is that when I wrote the play, I was really heavily influenced by playwrights like Pinter and Joe Orton. And, Joe Orton's writing style and his character were crystallized in prison, where he said he learned objectivity. And he said that he didn't really learn to write until he discovered objectivity about society and about the mechanics of it and its kind of mores and tastes. And then Pinter was a great one for ambiguity.
Yeah.
And ambivalence, and he was somebody who'd grown up in the East End, in a Jewish family when fascism was rife. And his work always had this kind of spine of ambivalence and ambiguity, which gave it its drama and its balance. And I was determined to make that one of my kind of abiding principles. And you can see that in the play. And I'm glad it's the thing that James likes about the play, which is that it's genuinely objective. It sees all the different views and it accords them equal space and time. And it's genuinely ambivalent in some ways. And I think that theatre right now, ambivalence is verboten. Objectivity is sneered at. It's considered cold and incorrect. And you are expected to subscribe to whatever orthodoxy is going around. And this play is deliberately, intentionally, almost provocatively ambivalent and prepared to look at every side of the coin, no matter how ugly.
Well, I think that's one of the most important themes of the play in itself. So the ambiguity is the point. There's almost everything in the play is ambiguous, and ambiguity, ambivalence doesn't necessarily mean cold. This is pretty heated, the debate in the play. It's an emotional play as well. And I think coming back to the title, it seems to me it also serves as an indicator about how we label things. And clearly that we go through this with the issues of mental health and diagnosing it and putting labels on people and the conditions. And that doing that is not an easy or unambiguous thing, is it? Therefore, the ambiguity is important here. And it sort of references that, I guess what you're saying also is that there are different ways to see the world, that people do see the world differently. And I love there was a reference in the play to this poem by Paul Eluard, which is Le monde est bleu comme un orange. The world is blue as an orange. And I looked the poem up, Joe, doing my homework. I'll have to say it wasn't straightforward to decipher what this poem was doing. It's a piece of surrealism. Paul Eluard was one of the founders of the surrealist movement in France after the First World War. So it's kind of hard to literally decipher this poem. But there is a line where it says, never a mistake, words do not lie, which I think you're possibly challenging all the way through the play, that words actually do lie and how we use them is arbitrary and obviously subject to ambiguities, as you've said. Thinking about the ambiguities and being two things at once or contradictions, Terry Johnson wrote somewhere, I think it was on the intro to one of the editions of the play, that there are paradoxes in the individual characters as well. And I wanted to ask you about how you drew the characters and how do you see the characters. James, did you identify these sorts of conflicting traits in each of the individual characters? How would you describe these characters?
I think without question, it interested me, and anecdotally, recently I was reading an account of that extraordinary time in New York in the 60s and 70s when lots of visual artists collaborated with theatre makers, and then they were all asked at the end of the process what they'd learnt about one another's art forms. And the painter Jasper Johns said this extraordinary thing about the playwrights that he'd worked with, which is he said that I now understand that the art of theatre is about taking a thing, changing it and changing it again. And I think really in so many ways, that was the experience we found of trying to fashion these characters and the decisions that they make, and that you've got to make a set of assumptions about them, but life is complex and it's not black and white, it's all of the grey spaces in between. And so actually taking a thing, changing it again is the art of building in a character, but it's also one of the great rewards of working with acting company to realize these parts that Joe has created, because at every moment it feels like the choices that they make are both surprising and inevitable at the same time. That they continue to shock us as an audience, but they make complete sense when we think about the logic. And we talk so much today about this idea of speaking our own truth, but too often that means actually speaking one version of the truth. And the kind of orthodoxy that Joe talked about earlier, I think does now exist both within art and within the media. And it's rarely acknowledged today that it is possible for human behavior to contradict itself. And what keeps us so interesting is I think as Shakespeare says, that actually the yarn of morality is about contradiction. It's about good and bad, literally stitched, alongside one another at every turn. And these characters are so thrilling to work with because they're so rife with contradictions, and the way in which they try to forge their place in the world is complex, really complex. And over the course of the play, that is a thrilling journey for an actor to go on. But it also means that the work that you do as a director in working with these actors has to ask both how they feel, but also how they act, and how sometimes the way that we feel isn't the way that we act in the world.
James makes a great point, which is the predication of policy and art and social media commentary on the so-called truth, which is the orthodoxy now, precludes the notion that you might not know the truth.
Yeah.
Everybody who speaks truth to power or speaks the truth, that's predicated on their conviction that they know the truth, and that whoever they're speaking to doesn't know the truth. And I grew up with the somewhat ambiguous orthodoxy that not many people did know the truth. It's very, very difficult to know the truth. And it's really interesting, operating in the world today where there are people that apparently do know the truth and are prepared to speak it at every opportunity. Having said that, I'm very, very, very good friends with people who speak truth to power. But we're just different in that I'm a lot more skeptical and fluid and ambivalent. But that's another very simple thing that the play challenges. What exactly is the truth, and how slippery is it? And, Pinter used to say that his plays were about the weasel under the cocktail cabinet. And in this play, there's the Paul Elward poem, there's the reference to Tintin, there's all sorts of red herrings flying around in this institution, this medical institution, which one would assume was predicated on truthfulness and virtue. And the discovery that shock horror doctors aren't necessarily always 100% truthful and virtuous and bereft of ego was kind of a big revelation when I was younger and wrote the play.
Well, you're saying about changing and changing and changing as well, it's very disconcerting to play because it's very hard to get a handle on any of the individual characters and where they stand. As you say, they contradict themselves. And sometimes you feel like you can trust them and other times not. And what are their motives? Each of them has multiple perspectives and motives, and it's all in a sort of real-time live mix that is very hard to pin down. And that's what human beings are, right?
Well, yeah, and you've got to look at the 20th century, which, it began with this impulse towards utilitarianism and social equality and progressiveness. And the assumption was that politics was in the business of achieving that. And by extension, medicine and law were in the business of achieving utilitarianism for the greater good. And, towards the end of the 20th century, going into the 21st century, we began to realize that that wasn't necessarily so. This play was forged in the era of spin, where, people discovered to their horror that the government was spinning the facts to create a more voter-friendly narrative. And that impulse has only strengthened over the years. And I think that where we are now, with what we were just discussing, with people sort of weaponizing their truth, is just a different version of that, really. And I think that, we're well and truly now in the era where, if anything, the reverse is true. And there's a general assumption that politics is about chicanery and dishonesty, and people don't tend to trust politicians at all now.
Yeah.
And that's the big reversal that's probably happened in the last 30 or 40 years.
I was listening to a radio program this week, I just caught part of, which was talking about the history of politics from that perspective, in the sense of what were the motives for people involved in power. There was, I think, in Western democracy, some idea that politicians were getting into it for the common good of some kind. There was some kind of moral reason for their serving, which seems a long way from what we think of today. Anyway, we could spend quite a long time talking about those sorts of worldviews. Try and bring it back to the play itself a little bit in terms of these particular characters. And, we're talking about their contradictions. So Bruce, the young doctor, for example, he seems pretty dedicated initially, pretty smart, but he's also ambitious, and he's a little bit self-righteous, and he's emotionally naive, and he perhaps has a chip on his shoulder. And so he's, again, needs all these complicated things. He's not just one thing, which we start off thinking about him. And Christopher is extremely hard to pin down, which we'll come to, because he's quite volatile and therefore very hard to pin down. And Robert appears to be this relatively smooth establishment figure. He's arrogant and intelligent, but he's also kind of rash and a bit frivolous and not very disciplined. He's certainly very self-centered. and in fact, selfish and ruthless in the end, and has all sorts of ambition.
You've pretty much summed up my worldview. Isn't that what most people are? Those two guys, apart from nuns maybe, but that's kind of how people are.
Yeah, it's true. The structure of the play, I was going to say, is relatively simple in that it takes place within 24 hours in a linear chronology. It all takes place in the same room. There are no changes in the set. It's a three-hander, only these three characters. Why did you choose this form, Joe, to write the play in?
Because the original idea came from an experience I had in California where I had done some voluntary work with a large group of paranoid schizophrenics. One of them was very like Christopher in that he was an African-American from the South who believed that he was white sometimes and he believed that he was a woman sometimes. It was a great story, and I wrote it up as a play with many, many characters, workshopped it and found it to be way too unwieldy and kind of distant to my experience. So then after struggling with it for a long time, I came up with the idea to reduce it down like a sauce to the most concentrated, basic version with the least possible characters, which was 3, and the smallest, simplest possible setting, on the basis that it was such a complicated narrative and such a complicated idea and such a complicated twisting, turning argument that the audience needed some very simple things to clutch hold of while they're trying to land the plane, So a chair, a bowl of oranges, and 3 men in a room seemed an artistic imperative, really, to simplify it as much as possible.
James, what were the challenges to you in creating drama in this limited setting? Where do you think the drama comes from when you just push it all into this confined space?
Well, I think it's theatre is its most essential, really. And when it's stark and stripped back, that's really, it's really both an acting company and a director, and that kind of pressure cooker of an environment is pure theatre, particularly when there's as many moving parts as there are with the constant twists and turns within the emotional dynamics of this piece. The character of Robert quotes Allen Ginsberg at some point in the play, and I think he quotes Ginsberg as saying is that human isn't a noun, but that it's a verb. It's kind of a lovely moment because it describes how people can go into any situation with the best of intentions, but ultimately we're dependent, irrational animals, and things do change. And you have to judge people's behavior based upon the way that they interact with one another when the stakes raise. And I remember early in the process, Joe talked to me a little bit about the ethos of this piece being like a piece of jazz music. And it's something I found very useful because that's obviously an improvised art form, effectively. And it's one that is all about the players, in that you need your key musicians to be in a room together, sparring off one another. And then jazz music catches fire. And I think probably to misquote Miles Davis, when he was asked always how he played his music, he used to say, "I don't play music, I play changes." And actually that's, of course, goes back to that same idea we were talking earlier, that these characters bring such fixed perspectives and ideas and beliefs into the room, but as soon as they push up against the contrasting ideas and behaviors of other characters in the space, then that's where it becomes really interesting. So it does mean that this wonderful argumentative piece, so full of dilemmas and rich debates, is also one where we've really got to mind colour and texture and variety, so that you're playing the full spectrum of different emotions, but also different ways of making your argument. And actually, when you know that that's the focus, you don't need anything else other than a four-sided stage.
Yeah, I should have remembered that humanism is a verb when you're talking about everything changing as they rub off, not even just rub off, but they spar, as you said earlier, with one another. And of course, wonderful for the actors to have this improvisation, almost the rhythms between them. But the setting, it struck me, was I'm thinking, Joe, that the reviews of the first production likened it to a boxing ring with a confined space where there's the battle, because we see a battle of wills going on here between the three of them, in particular between the two doctors. They're circling each other, dodging, hitting out, defending, all that goes on. There's this real sense of a threat and energy, almost physical, as they move within this combined space.
Yeah.
And we forensically were watching the relationships and every nuance of the dialogue between them, aren't we? Because there's nothing else. We're not being distracted by any other pyrotechnics on the stage. It's just what they're saying to each other and the battles that they're having in language and communication and relationship.
Well, I always found, theatre that tries to convince the audience that they're on a battlefield or at a beach or, in heaven or wherever. That kind of theatre doesn't ever convince me. Probably because I can do films as well. So my attitude is just to make a film. But people in a room talking is real, is super real. You know, it's really convincing because people do talk in rooms in real life.
Yeah.
So the play was consciously, and a lot of my plays are like this, they consciously are people in rooms talking because that's realistic. And, you know, the audience quite quickly buy into it and suspend their disbelief, which the theatre requires you to do very quickly.
I was going to say it's much easier to suspend the disbelief. There is not much to disbelieve, is there?
It's quite technical, but that's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
If you're going to start floating the ideas that we float in the play, you want the audience to be already buying in and trusting it and believing it.
I think what's fascinating as well, of course, is that you, as you said earlier about the ambiguity, deliberately aren't loading the dice either. The structure is a dialectic, I think, as you said earlier, James, where we see several conflicting perspectives, arguments both ways, and we keep trying to absorb and assemble these into some kind of consensus, a conclusion, but it keeps frustrating us from doing that, which is the point, I think, of the play, that there isn't a simple answer, like mental health is not simple. There are variable states we all live in. So you end up having to try and evaluate the integrity of the characters and their positions and aligning them with their positions. And therefore, who do we trust? Who do we believe? Do we trust their motives or not, or what they're saying? But a lot of it comes down to the language itself. We talked about this in relation to the title, in terms that the title suggests that language can be used in a number of different ways. And I noticed when I saw the show last week, James, that in the very first act, in the first exchange between Bruce and Christopher, they're speaking incredibly rapidly, almost over each other at times. And I was interested in the rhythm of the language that Joe's written in the play and how you saw it being delivered. And of course, what your intent with it was.
I think that really the music of the text is something that Joe gifts us in the way that he lays it out on the page, in that it is so extraordinarily precise in the way that it captures the way that people do talk to one another, but also the way that they try to get their voice across and to puncture through their arguments. But also, you know, the vernacular of each of these characters is so different and says so much about their class, their heritage, their status, and the way even that actually something of the accent, the vernacular of each of the characters changes as well when they come into contact with one another. I mean, we see effectively two slightly different Bruces in the first 20 pages of the play. A Bruce that is trying to build affinities with Christopher, and then a Bruce that tries to build a very different relationship with Robert. And literally the way these people talk to each other changes. So yes, it's three instruments in this piece of jazz music, but we also see often these characters really shift the music of the way that they speak to each other according to whatever the situation demands.
Absolutely right, because there's great moments early on when Bruce sort of tries to emulate Christopher in terms of the vernacular language, and it's sort of pathetic to watch.
Well, he adopts his vernacular in a very disastrous way and then reaps the horrible consequences of it.
I was also going to ask you what your thoughts were about language being manipulated and how we use it, as we said, with Blue Orange to affix labels, but also even just between them, how language is concocted and manipulated, particularly within conflict and formal contexts in which the doctors are operating, for example.
Well, you know, I'm a language freak, really, and I've got an ear that's a bit like the babelfish in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where I can tune into different vernaculars, and they reveal to me, you know, character. And my plays are always really about language, and they're always really about what people are saying and what they're not saying, and what they're trying to say and what they're masking. And then I also hear language very musically as well, you know, and I think some vernaculars are more musical than other vernaculars, but Christopher's vernacular is quite musical, rhythmic and potent. And in a sense, the other characters are trying to catch up, and they're trying to impose their will using their own vernacular. And one thing that's always been really evident to me is the better educated you are, the more articulate you are, the more power you have. And so that happens in the play, and you see Bruce and Robert, who are very articulate and very well educated, generally trying to impose their will and trying to divide the power up between the two of them. And Christopher, who has a much more kind of ad hoc vernacular, is left behind a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely language is an instrument of power, no question. And the doctors use, for example, the medical jargon as a means of exerting control over Christopher and between each other. Christopher's obviously at a disadvantage in not knowing these terms, and therefore isn't participating on equal ground when they start at that level. So yeah, I think there is a lot in there about power and about institutional language, so that you you talked about Robert and his education and things. I think one of the fascinating things is that the more educated Robert is, and the more attuned he is with the language of the institutions he's working in and represents, the further from truth he can become. We can see the difference between what he's saying and what it's being meant, and whether it has any real meaning or the way he's twisting it.
Well, the interesting thing about Robert is that Robert really is a contradiction and a dichotomy in that at his most enjoyable, he's inauthentic.
Yeah.
And the part was kind of minted by Bill Nye, who's an incredibly attractive silver-tongued baddie. But then he does say things that connote tremendous insight, and a unique insight. You know, the things that he says about Christopher's background and what might have happened to his mother in Uganda. The interesting thing is the audience assumes that he's juggling nonsense, pretentious nonsense, but in actual fact, all of that is completely authentic. These are all things that I picked up when I went to Africa to look into this subject. So what's interesting is that it plays a game where it sets the audience up at any given moment to think that Robert's being inauthentic and untrustworthy. And then the next minute, he said something tremendously authentic and kind of righteous and soothing for the audience. And what I love about the play and what I love about James's version is that it takes that as one of its guiding principles, really. And the idea of making Giles Torreira a senior consultant in this, important hospital who's got a Black British identity is kind of beautiful because it takes up the challenge of when is he authentic and when is he inauthentic? When has he got empathy and when is he just telegraphing empathy? And it really forces the audience to work very hard in understanding notions of authenticity and when are people just being politically correct and when does it spring from instinct and experience and when is it tactical, when is it being deployed for reasons of ego and ambition. And I think that's front and center in this play. And I think this production, which James and Giles and Michael have come up with, for me, it's beautiful because it's making that the lead instrument.
Absolutely. It comes back to some of that points we were making about ambiguity as well. In the arguments of the play, there are times where you think Robert's completely crazy with some of his statements and views, and you think he's just playing a game and he's inauthentic, as you say. It's all performative. It's not real. But there are other times where he says something that sounds very, very sensible in the argument.
There are other times where you see unmistakable empathy between him and Michael, and those moments are very touching.
Yeah. Coming to the heart of the play about mental health, you talked earlier about working in America and having this direct experience of those with schizophrenia. So at the heart of the play, Christopher is suffering from some form of mental distress. And as we've said, there is this extended debate about the specific possible diagnosis and the doctors and the language they use and the power between them, including rehearsing the definitions of schizophrenia, et cetera. And for much of the play, we're trying to pin down how normal is Christopher? What is his condition? And what was fascinating was that when I was at the show last week and at the after show discussion, there was a woman in the audience who said she couldn't decide whether Christopher was ill or not. And she was asking the cast on the stage, tell me, what is the answer? Is Christopher ill or not? So James, I want to know what your take when you're directing, for example, Christopher's performance or thinking about the balance of the debate in the play and him as a character. How do you decide how ill, in quotation marks, is Christopher?
I might defer to Joe in terms of answering the second part to that question, but I think always in the rehearsal room, you have to work with a company to encourage them to make strong decisions and then to really ask how much of that decision they're wanting to reveal to the audience. And often the worst thing you can do in a rehearsal room is to sit on the fence because then an audience has absolutely no sense of what they're responding to or engaging with. So, we really did do our homework, I hope, in terms of thinking about the experience of living with schizophrenia. And of course, it is an illness that so many of those in the rehearsal room were familiar with through friends and family and experience of caring for those suffering from schizophrenia in their own lives. We also worked with several psychiatrists, both senior psychiatrists like Robert, as well as junior doctors like Bruce's character. And so, my feeling always is that you have to do your own work, you have to throw a lot of paint to the canvas, but then in terms of what sticks, that's got to be all about the language on the page and how much Joe wants to reveal to his audience through what he maps out in the script. And both in the language as well as in the stage directions. It does feel like we are getting a sense of just occasionally seeing the layers of the onion peel back and reveal a little bit of what lies beneath. And that's not always through dialogue. Sometimes it might be through a moment where Christopher grasps hold of Robert's hand for an unusually long period of time. And suddenly, as an audience, we spot that actually there must be some kind of physical manifestation, either of an illness or of the medicine that is used to treat that illness.
There are times, Joe, in the text when Robert in particular, I think several times alludes to the idea that Christopher is not ill. It's normal. We all experience some of these things. So he's often saying, look around, who isn't disorganized and who isn't impulsive and prone to extreme behavior and who isn't disappointed and all those things. Continuing to leave us in some doubt or suggest doubt. But I read somewhere that you don't think it's really that doubtful.
I don't want to give the game away for the audience, but what I would say is that I'm most interested in the notion that they're both right, that it's quite possible for people to be both telling the truth about a very complicated, unbelievable background and also ill. The one doesn't necessarily follow on from the other. And certainly when I wrote the play, I was very passionate about conveying to people that most people have very, very complicated backgrounds, and telling them who they are and what their identity is just not okay. And that's a notion that now is the currency. And the other thing that I wanted passionately to say was that mental illness is very complicated and works in unexpected ways. And most people can't really tell whether it's there or not. It's not like it is on TV. So that's why the play is that way. And that's why the audience is forced to sit there for 2 hours trying to figure it all out, because I really felt that only by sitting an audience down and putting them through it would they learn anything, and would it be of any value.
You're absolutely right. I think we come away, and the audience expressed this as well in the cast in this discussion afterwards, that the point is not about being definitive and about labels, that more of the point is about some sort of recognitions, empathy, tolerance for differences, recognizing that we all have some traumas that we are processing some of the time as well. And how do we come up with the judgments we make? And then schizophrenia in particular, there's a great speech, which if you'll forgive me, if I'm just going to read a couple of lines up, which Robert says, again, one of his truthful things, I think, when he says schizophrenia is the worst pariah, one of the last great taboos. People don't understand it. They don't want to understand it. It scares them. It depresses them. It is not treatable with glamorous and intriguing wonder drugs like Prozac or Viagra. It isn't newsworthy. It isn't curable. It isn't heroin or ecstasy. It is not the preserve of rock stars and supermodels and hip young authors. It is not a topic of dinner party conversations. Organized crime gets better press, etc. Brilliant stuff. And of course, we come away feeling that this is too thorny to really understand, of course, and that's the truth of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it goes back to what I was saying about, if you think you know the truth and you think you understand the truth about your fellow man, then you're mistaken. Often you might do sometimes, but we know that the world is very, very complicated now.
One of the interesting things about the structure, the way you present the character as well, is that we don't really see entirely inside Christopher's head. How could we, in fact? And we're basically like the doctors. Everyone is trying to judge each other from the outside, and which is almost impossible by definition, I guess. I wanted to come back to talk about race, because we've touched on a couple of times, but not talked explicitly yet about the casting in your production and also the way the play deals with the subject of race. So in the original production, Christopher, as we've said, is Black, and Bruce and Robert are both white. You mentioned Bill Nighy playing Robert in the original production. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but this is not blind casting that Giles Terrera plays Robert and is Black in this version of the play. So, James, was it your idea, or was it, as you said earlier at the beginning, it came out of conversations with Giles as well? But how did you come to the view that this would be appropriate, and how does it change perspectives on the play?
So very much the project came across as a collaboration, really, and it was an idea born of discussion with Giles, and he, I think, had been hugely moved by the production when he first saw it, continues to feel that it holds such weight and relevance today, and perhaps even speaks more powerfully to our own age for all the reasons that we've discussed. and really felt that if he was to create this role in collaboration with Joe, Michael, Ralph, myself, that he could widen the bandwidth of the way that we talk about race through the lens of this play.
I found in first reading it or seeing it with two doctors being white that how uncomfortable that all is, that they have the power and the way they talk about race, most of which they get wrong. It is different, isn't it? How do you see how different it is when things that you've written in Robert's voice are coming from a black man now?
Well, it's incredibly complicated. But I think, first of all, we have to accept that up until quite recently, that's what this country was like. I mean, that's what it was like for hundreds of years. Whether people in positions of power were discussing race or gender or any other aspect of identity, that was just how it was. And usually it was the highly educated, privileged Anglo-Saxons in the room that got to have the discussion. So we can't pretend that it wasn't always like that and that things have only started to change very slowly and gradually. And now we're suddenly at this moment where it seems absurd that two white people will be discussing a black British character's race. So I think for that reason, it's kind of an imperative to have different casting. But for me, I was also just really, really interested in the idea that Robert is the most powerful person in the room and one of the most powerful people in the hospital. He's the best educated. He's the smartest. He's the most experienced. He has the most power. He is, as he says, the authority. And I was really interested in seeing a black character who held that status. And I wanted to see that. And I think Giles wanted to see that too. He wanted to see that on stage, and he wanted to see a character who not only had a lot of status and responsibility, but also had a terrible dilemma. Life is very complicated for people, no matter what class they come from. So Christopher he's a character that we've seen on stage many, many times, comes from a very, very rough, violent background with terrible social deprivation. And then Robert is the exact opposite of that. And I think Giles was passionate about wanting to articulate that. And it was the passion and the articulacy of what he was saying that swayed me. It seemed to be coming from a place of intelligence and insight and provocation, and I couldn't resist, really.
Well, I think it really enhances the issues that are raised in the play about race and our perceptions. And it certainly changes the dynamics between the characters to some degree and the way the arguments start to unfold and their relations, because I guess you would assume that Bruce and a white Robert would have shared that in some way when they talk about race, whereas it's the reverse now. So there's a point of difference between them, not a point of union. And then there's a point of union in some way between Robert and Christopher just by race. But as you say, they are so far apart socioeconomically that maybe that's the more important feature. But when you start to examine all the things that the characters are saying, and I mean, he has a theory about mental illness being based on race, and we talk about Christopher's environment and background and the kind of abuse he suffered from police stop and search or football hooligans or whatever. And there's a great speech that reminds us that this kind of attitude to race still prevails, where Christopher says his neighbors are fascists. And Robert says neighbors is everybody, isn't it? People in the street giving you a wide berth, women on escalators holding their handbag a little tighter as you pass, people looking straight through as if you're not even there. Very concise but vivid expression of some of what we still know is going on.
Well, I was just going to say that's a good example of, in this version of the play, Robert is being utterly authentic, and he's talking from experience, his own experience. He's not talking from an appropriated experience for career reasons or ego reasons. That was the great challenge of this play, to see if he could have these moments of authenticity and also have moments of ego and ambition, and whether it would complicate it so much that it spun off the road, or whether it made it satisfyingly substantial for the 21st century. And I've had very little to do with this production, but I've poked my head in the door every now and again and helped tweak things. And I've got to say that I think it's incredibly substantial and satisfying. I think they've done an incredible job.
Yeah, I agree. James, what are you going to say?
Well, just personally, I think this is a play that will be revived. And for me, that is partly because even though it's a State of the Nation play, it's not so much about where it takes place or when it takes place. And one of the brilliant sleights of hand, I think, that Joe pulls off in this piece is that it's an encounter between three people in a public space, like so many of his plays are. And in that respect, it's about the way that people treat each other and the universal aspects of human behavior that don't change. And I think for that kind of reason, it is a play that audiences map their own experiences onto, and which also great imaginative actors can really bring something of themselves to. And for me, in many ways, it's kind of in that rich tradition of plays by writers like Samuel Beckett or Clifford Odets or Sam Shepard or O'Neill or Edward Albee, and that it's about people meeting in public spaces that perhaps might not interact with each other outside of those environments, whether they're professional environments or not, and actually how the melting pot of their ideas and their backgrounds and their experiences spar off one another in a way that teaches us all something about ourselves. And that was such a thrilling prospect in the rehearsal room because the language is so precise, the characterization is so precise, and Joe clearly has created this piece of work born of enormous research and lived experience and detail. But even though it is a piece that is set within a psychiatric hospital that is about two doctors and a patient, it could just as well be about so many other workplace environments. It could just as well be about other themes regarding medicine and science and mental health, heritage, ethnicity, gender. They really are these big, thorny topics that will always be at the heart of how we interact with one another. And part of the joy of reviving a play like this is, like the traditions of so many of the other writers I've just cited, it will always be a slightly different play for a different age. And each of the actors involved in creating it are going to find very, very different things to connect with in realizing these characters.
I love the idea that you just suggested about how these are so different, these people that are forced together. In a sense, that's a microcosm of our world, our global world now, where we are all living not homogeneously as we once were in the same way. And how do we get along and judge each other? And that seems to be one of the fundamental issues of our time, frankly, as to how we do that.
And our need to belong, I think. Interestingly, I've talked a lot about difference, but actually we kind of found in the rehearsal room that the most important thing to mind was what these people had in common, because they're the moments of connection where audiences get huge emotional access to these characters and start to become very protective of them and fond of them, because actually it's not just about how they treat each other badly, but also how at times they treat each other with trust and compassion and great kindness as well.
Although I would say about the way that regardless of race, I think that they relate to each other in relation to the hierarchies of the positions they're in and the way they exert that power. We talked earlier about the doctors, of course, using language that Christopher's not privy to or whatever, but there's a real sense that the way Robert wields his power as a senior in the institution he's in and how that can be abused and how we take up positions and relate to each other based on these kinds of assumed hierarchies, as opposed to, what did you say earlier about humanism as a verb, that it's not fixed, but we get so distorted by behaving in that way, don't we? As Joe, that was clearly deliberate, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was deliberate because I knew people that were in the medical profession and they all said to me that it's incredibly hierarchical. And I think the legal profession is very hierarchical and politics is very hierarchical. And I think business is probably quite hierarchical. And not so much now as it used to be in the 20th century, because in the 21st century, people are much more in the business of calling people out and exposing fraudulence and the bogusness of hierarchy. Again, I think it's another of the things that people pretend isn't there now and they mask it. It's de rigueur to mask your hierarchical impulses, but people are still the same. They still want the most power and the most seniority if they can get it. They want to exert their ego if they can. They're just a lot more surreptitious about it. Language is a lot more surreptitious now. It's not that there aren't racists anymore. It's just that the racists are smart enough to know that they can't deploy racist language. They still exist.
I think one of the dangers you do see is the way institutional language or even politically correct language can be used as a weapon. So it reminded me of David Mamet's Oleana, actually, when Bruce is backed into the corner based on this report that says, he's used racist language and he's been patronizing and all this. It just sounded like the way that these things get twisted really easily if you want to play those sort of games with institutional language.
Yeah, and you can do that in institutions. Universities are becoming notorious now as places where language is weaponized and used with tremendous hostility. And the other thing about language, not only is language weaponized, but also language provides a cover, as I said. If you deploy the right language, you can use it to mask the wrong impulses.
Yes.
And I'm just fascinated by all that. And I'm not extolling any particular political philosophy. I'm just fascinated by the mechanics of it, by the discordant music of it. And I'm also constantly amazed that people aren't more aware of it, that people tend to swallow the dominant orthodoxy of the moment without ever questioning to what extent these things are being deployed for insidious ends.
Yeah. Speaking of ends, I think we've come near the end. And the ending of the play, I wanted to briefly ask you about. It looks like at the ending of the play, maybe if it's a battle, Robert has won. Christopher is to be released. Robert will be in charge of his case. Bruce abjectly pleads with him for a chance to go back to where they were before, tries to appease and flatter him to get him to withdraw this complaint, threat to his employment. But in the end, Robert just stomps on him when he's down and says, I don't like you, Bruce. You're not to be employed by this authority again. And we think that's it. However, is that it? Where do you think we leave the theater thinking about what's happened there?
Well, rather than try and give you a steer, I'd quite like to say something very interesting that we discovered in the production and in the previews, which was that in the previous 20 years of doing this play, the ending was always pretty clear that Robert had weaponized language and his ego had got the better of him and he had trampled all over Bruce in a fairly unfair way.
Mm-hmm.
And when Bruce at the end mutters a few words about, I'm going to make a complaint now, the audience was kind of under no illusion that now Bruce was going to have his revenge, right? And the whole thing was going to start all over again. What was fascinating about doing the play now was that the ending wasn't working at all. It just wasn't an ending for people. And my theory is that the way that Robert unambiguously tramples all over Bruce and weaponizes language and contrives meaning where it's not necessarily there, we are so used to it. It is so unstoppable. It is so part of the vernacular that the notion that Bruce would complain about it and then launch a counterattack just seemed so distant as to be absurd. As far as the audience was concerned, Bruce had been utterly discredited. He'd used a racial epithet. He had no credibility whatsoever. He'd lost the argument and it was all over for him. The idea that actually that's doubtful, that he might not be racist, that he might have won the argument, that he might be right, just seems too difficult for the audience to believe. So we tweaked the ending slightly. And now it seems a lot clearer what he's complaining about and what he's girding his lawyers to do battle about. And I hope that doesn't sound like a load of obscure waffle, but I think it's another interesting reason why this play is a great play to do now, because people are substantially materially different to the way they were in the 20th century.
So, James, is Bruce done? What is the sense then from your perspective?
I mean, I hope, and obviously as an audience over last week, you'll be a better judge of this, I'm sure, than I. But I think, as Joe said, that rather than a kind of definitive full stop at the end of the production, which might have been the case in its first iteration, that we've aimed for a ... really at the end that kind of encourages the audience to say, actually, what is the corrupting power of this institution upon both of these men, and how might their battle continue to play out? And hopefully that's going to form part of the conversation that audiences continue to have as they leave the theatre.
I think it's still open because in the best possible sense, Joe, as we've been saying all along, the ambiguity is the thing, because actually there's this wonderful suggestion, that speech of Robert's, where he becomes almost messianic when he talks about people come to me, all creeds and colors. They are suffering. They go away. They no longer suffer because of me, all because of me. And you're thinking, wait a minute, Robert's completely lost it.
That's quite revealing, that speech. Yeah.
So, I mean, the idea that these guys are judging someone else's mental health, that's, I guess, part of the point. Who are we to judge?
Well, exactly. And when somebody comes along and says that they are God and they've got all the solutions, some people know not to trust that.
Yeah, I would hope everybody does, but maybe not.
Not everybody, but some people.
Politics of our day would suggest not everybody does, but let's keep saying it. Well, that's got us where we need to get to, I think. Thank you very much. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests if they could recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. So I think, James, you've had some forewarning of this at least. Is there a personal favorite from something you've directed already, or perhaps a play that you want to direct in the future that you'd be happy to nominate?
Forgive me, I didn't have that forewarning, so I'll have to improvise.
I can give you one. This is a play that I think is an exquisite play, and it trades on the same dark currencies that Blue Orange trades on. I admire it tremendously, and I think it's slightly underrated, and it deserves to be revived as quickly as possible. And this is a play called Downstate by Bruce Norris, which was on at the National Theatre 20 years after Blue Orange was on, in the same theatre, the Dorfman. And I just think it's an extraordinary play because it plays with notions of compassion and empathy, and at what points do we choose to withhold our compassion and empathy for these characters who have all been found guilty of terrible offenses. And it humanizes them in a way that, as far as I'm concerned, is totally real. I mean, I was a crime reporter. I saw a pretty rich tapestry of life's experience, and the normalcy and the apparent humanity of some quite terrible people is alarming and extraordinary and moving, and definitely the stuff of great drama. So it's a beautiful play, and it deserves to be a set text for GCSEs.
And a great suggestion. Sounds like another one to challenge how we come to judgments of other people.
Sure, for sure. It's a really great play.
James, any ideas?
Just on that same theme, I'm going to give a very lazy answer, which is the next piece I was lucky enough to direct, which is a play called Our Lady of Cabello by American playwright Tori Hall, which I hope is a play that will be done again and again. But the reason I mention it is really it's about the unique ability of theatre to examine a kind of suspension of disbelief, that kind of idea of whether what we see on stage in front of us can be taken at face value, whether it's real or whether actually the extraordinary is possible in our lives. And so again, a piece that takes very, very real characters and extraordinarily important topical debates. In this case, a piece set on the other side of the world in Rwanda, but one that speaks not to the present moment nonetheless. But really has at its heart that question of to what degree should we trust our first impressions, and why do you sometimes need a couple of hours to understand a topic in long form rather than condensing it down to the kind of very narrow-minded debates that we resort to too often today.
That sounds brilliant. In fact, that might even be a mantra for the Play podcast about taking time to look at things in more detail. And I'm conscious that I've taken a lot of your time. So thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been really stimulating and wonderful to have your thoughts on the play. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Douglas. That was a real pleasure, privilege.
Hey, Douglas.
As the curtain falls, 20 years on from when it was first performed, does what Blue Orange has to say remain topical in our changed society about the categorization of mental illness, the politics of medical care, the minefield of racial assumptions and communication, or the abuse of professional power? Yes, emphatically, these are all still recognizable and relevant. But it is also a play that will endure because it's about the way that we respond to each other, whatever relative positions we are in, whether we have power or are powerless, whether we consider ourselves sane or are less certain of our own mental health. It demonstrates the perils of self-centered, self-aggrandizing perspectives, of manipulating language to our own purpose, and of failing to be open to see the world as others do or are forced to. In short, to really care. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.